At this moment, I wish to hand over to our first lecturer, Ncazelo. Ncazelo, over to you.
Thank you very much to all the esteemed guests present for the invitation to share my work with you and just to speak to, what we do using culturally sensitive methodologies to support people who have experienced hardships and trauma. I will be putting up a couple of presentations just to, to be talking to as we go along. So my name is Ncazelo. I am based in South Africa and I run a non-profit organization focusing on responding to trauma. And so we work with communities, different communities of people who have experienced hardships and using locally developed methodologies that support them in their healing and in their recovery. So the history of my work begins in Zimbabwe, where I come from, early on around 2001, where I was given an invitation to work for a life skills camp program to support children affected by AIDS. As a young psychologist, I was very excited to have the opportunity to participate in an intervention that was addressing some of the very pressing issues of our time during that particular period. And so this life skills camp program, would have children come into an exciting camp environment for 10 days. And so these are children who were, impacted and affected by AIDS. Many of them had lost their parents. Many of the children were struggling with experiences of abuse and neglect. And during the time, there was stigma and discrimination and fear around contracting HIV. And so the young people that we were working with were experiencing numerous challenges. And then I was given a responsibility as a team leader to lead a team of young peer camp counselors who would be working alongside the children as brothers and sisters, but also needed to have basic counseling skills that, I was expected to sort of impart, to them. And so getting to the camp and getting to learn about children's experiences, I was very much struck around the complexity of young people's experiences. A lot of the children that came to our camps had not only lost one parent, but they'd lost, both parents. Some of them came to the camp without even knowing that their parents had died, because there was just a lot of, hesitation around talking to children about issues of death and dying. And so some of them would express being surprised at being at the camp. And so I would hear stories from children about, that since my parents died, I have moved from one village, one community to another, to different caregivers, the challenge of looking after me and my siblings have been quite a lot, because sometimes children had to be separated because people could not take in all of them at the same time. And so children would worry about issues of identity. I don't know who I am anymore. I feel totally dislocated. I've forgotten my people. They would also share stories like, I did not go to my mother's funeral. In my community, children are not allowed to bury, anyone. And so this is very difficult. I had no closure. I could not say goodbye. And so all these problems that children were talking to, I really found that the resources I had available at the time were really quite minimal. They did not seem to fit from a cultural perspective in terms of addressing the felt needs of the young people. And so, one of the things that really challenged me was hearing children talking about that they'd lost so many people in their lives. Parents died, other relatives also passed away. And so death seems to follow them wherever they go. And so I want to be cleansed. I need rituals performed so that I can get rid of this bad luck that seems to follow me. And I'll talk to them about what these rituals look like. And they seem to have, a bit of knowledge about what they were hoping for. And so thinking about what I'd learned, in the classroom, in the psychology classroom, did not really seem to have a strong fit. How do we address issues of identity? That children are so worried about, the dislocation from community. How do we talk to children about death? Children who have experienced a lot of hesitation and anxiety around the topic. So how do we do this in a way that would be helpful for the young people? But also, looking at the camp counselors and their responsibility of being alongside these children in a 10-day camp program. Camp after camp, they witness tragic stories around loss and death and just all the multiple stresses that young people were experiencing, and seeing the burnout that this came with, and then thinking as their team leader, how do I help these young people to be sustained in their roles of caring and supporting, children affected by AIDS? So all these predicaments and dilemmas brought about a desire to find ways of working that would be culturally resonant, that would allow children's concerns about identity to be addressed, that would allow children to talk about issues of death and dying, and at least, to be given an opportunity to express themselves and to talk about their own realities in a way that would be helpful, in a way that would give them a sense of hope. And so the search began on my part as the team lead to find, that kind of, psychosocial intervention that would be meaningful for the young people. So what we would do on the 5th day of the camp, I decided that we should sit down and give children in groups an opportunity to tell their story. We knew, of course, that this had not been something that they had been afforded time to do. And so in these groups, one child would start to share a story about what is going on in their life. And as they're doing that, the other children listening would be triggered by what, the person who's at the center is sharing. And before we know it, there is a massive wailing and crying and a collapse of the entire camp. And so this experience is going on in different locations of the camp. And so this day became known as the Day of Doom. We could predict with any camp that we run that 5th day of the camp would result in a total chaos. And so the Day of Doom became a huge issue. The young camp counselors working with the children would come to me to ask for my support, for my intervention. And I really felt limited in my ability to be able to guide them. They would say, this feels like opening a can of worms. And we just need to find a different way of being alongside the children so that at the end of the day, we do not have these experiences. And so just to kind of quickly wind down that story, I then participated in a regional convening, multi-country convening, where different countries came together to have conversations around experiences of working with children affected by AIDS and trying to identify good practices, best practices, and to learn and to inspire, each other. And it is during this convening that someone brought along a tool called the Tree of Life. So that was the lead facilitator for the meeting, and he had picked it up from somewhere. And so he really spoke to the fact that we have a big responsibility to support children affected by AIDS and ensure that their psychosocial and mental health needs are met. And so he found this tool and thought that we should all have an opportunity to draw a tree and tell stories and use the different tree metaphors to talk about our lives, our own stories. Perhaps starting the meeting in that way might give us inspiration, because we've been children, we have lived experience of overcoming perhaps hardships, although they might be different from what the children were going through. So he just had an idea, and I participated in this exercise, and really loved the idea of using a tree to represent, stories of our lives, each part of the tree, representing something quite different. And it was during that particular exercise that I started to think of the children at Masia camp and wondered, what it would be like to invite them into a more creative exercise that invited them to tell their stories, perhaps in a way that would be, more fun and less intrusive. And so this began the journey of using the Tree of Life as an intervention for children. And so what then happens is, along that journey, I then am introduced to narrative therapy by a colleague who saw my love and enthusiasm of using storytelling and finding ways of helping children affected by AIDS to tell their stories. And so he just said, you could look up the work of Michael White and the Dulwich Center, and perhaps that could add to what you have started and initiated with children affected by AIDS. And so I met Michael White, who is the founder of narrative therapy. Michael White was a social worker who'd spent a lot of time questioning taken for granted ways of, responding to mental health. And so a lot of what he had taken to doing involved an appreciation that people are the experts of their lives, and that as therapists, we need to be present alongside people so that they are accessing the stories of their lives that can help them to heal and to recover from trauma. We spoke a lot about the importance of culture, and that we needed to be grounded in community and in culture. And so listening to Michael White teach really resonated in many, many different ways. And I took very strongly to the narrative worldview, started to appreciate that, people have knowledge, people have skills, and that, it is not about fixing people's lives, but it's about being alongside people in respectful ways, in ways that allow them to access their own knowledges and their skills. And so listening to him teach really got me thinking about the numerous challenges I had with my work with children affected by AIDS, creating spaces where children would vent out and tell their stories was very problematic, very re-traumatizing. And so his ideas spoke, to my heart, basically. Meeting Michael White really brought about a huge shift to the way that I started to look at what therapy is and what it is all about. And so narrative therapy, for those of you who may not be very familiar with the approach, is a respectful, non-blaming approach to counseling and community work, which centers people as the experts of their lives. And it views problems as being separate from people and assumes that people have many skills and competencies and beliefs and commitments that will help them to deal with their predicaments. It's a very empowering approach that focuses on story, on helping people to restory their lives, with this understanding that problem stories, dominant stories, as we sometimes call them, can trap people into a very limited way of living their lives and seeing who they are. So when we work with people in problem-saturated ways, it just doesn't help to create the hope that we want to bring. And so thinking about the Day of Doom with the children and how sharing stories was about the problem, helped me to understand why children were, triggered, because it was a very problem-saturated approach to working, with young people. I got to appreciate that life is multi-storied, and that there are many stories to people's lives. It's not just the trauma stories. And so thinking about how to help people to access the other stories of their lives so that they start to experience themselves as being much bigger and, than the problems they are subject to. Acknowledging that people have skills, they have hopes, they've got dreams, and that these are alternative stories that we need to be equally curious about, and that when we invite people who've gone through trauma to talk to us, it's not just talking about the trauma stories, but it's helping them to access stories about their skills, their hopes, their dreams. And when people start to inhabit the second stories, they become less vulnerable to trauma, and they become a bit more creative in finding ways to deal with their predicaments. So when I met Michael White and I started to learn about his narrative approach, I invited him to come to Messiah Camp and see the work that we started doing with children using the Tree of Life tool. And it was after the meeting, and this trip that he made to Messiah Camp, that, his partner, Cheryl White, then, suggested that I take up the tool and find ways to adapt it so that it incorporates these ideas that I'm talking to you about. And so this began a collaboration between David Denborough and myself to produce a Tree of Life methodology or approach that encapsulates these fantastic ideas that speak to culture, and that speak to alternative stories, and helping people to move from thin conclusions about their lives to something richer and more sustaining. And so this is how what is now called the Tree of Life methodology was, developed. And so I want to specifically then talk to you about my journey, learning about the importance of culture and indigenous knowledges, because, it was Michael White's invitation through his teaching that we needed to find ways of being alongside people who've gone through trauma and hardships so that we can be privileging their own knowledges about healing and recovery. And so I really took this invitation quite strongly because I was aware that a lot of the experiences that children had shared with me had to do with their culture, their traditions, their beliefs. And this very much informed their sense of who they are. And so I've come to understand that we cannot provide psychosocially sound interventions, mental health interventions that were, excluding of people's cultural knowledges, because people tap into their culture to make meaning of their lives, to find healing. And so that this what became sort of the genesis of my own journey around being curious about issues of culture and so on. So I just want to just quickly mention that over the years, I have called my work an Imbeleko approach to the provision of therapy. And this, also has a very long story about how the Imbeleko blanket has become a symbol of what inspires me to do the work that I do with communities. The Imbeleko practice, is one that is very common amongst many African countries. This is how we hold our children. This is how we keep them safe. We keep them warm. And so, along the course of my journey, I've used and worked with projects that have used this practice as something that represents African knowledges and indigenous knowledges around caring for our children. And so being involved in these types of projects got me thinking about how I could go beyond looking at Ncazelo as something that represents our own indigenous knowledges, but rather as something that talks to how we should be holding, communities and people who've experienced trauma. I have my own Ncazelo story. When I was about 4 years old, 4 years old, my parents divorced, and it was a very confusing time for us, my siblings and myself. And my mom had to move away from home. And what happened was that there's an aunt who moved in to help look after us. I don't know what my aunt saw in me, but for months on end, she carried me within the Ncazelo blanket. And it felt extremely warm and safe and comforting. To this very day, I have very vivid memories of my aunt's intervention. And so that personal experience, that personal story is partly why I got excited about drawing on the Ncazelo practice and beginning to use it as something that inspires how I hold people in therapy, creating a sense of warmth, of comfort, of reassurance, and that we can only learn how to do this in our own communities if we invite people to educate us about what gives them that sense of warmth. What is it that we can be doing that gives them that sense of safety and connectedness, and so on. And so in my work, Ncazelo has become what inspires our practice. It's not just about the methodologies that we use, but it's about how we join in with people and the therapeutic context that we try to establish, inviting people to share their cultural knowledges, their, different practices that can help them to heal and to recover from trauma. And so this is, what my work has become more and more about. And what excites me is that, the blanket metaphor is something that is relatable across different cultures and communities. When we are born and we are received by a blanket. And throughout the journeys of our lives, a blanket features. Children have a favorite blanket. Some people have kept their blanket that they had as a child, even up to adulthood. We give blankets to the poor, to the homeless. Blankets are used in marriage ceremonies, in funeral ceremonies. And so there's something about the blanket metaphor that really resonates as a way of helping me to think about, how to join in with people who have experienced trauma. And so getting quickly into the Tree of Life methodology. So Tree of Life then becomes an approach or a methodology that incorporates all these ideas, working with a narrative therapy perspective around people being experts of their lives, people being skilled and knowledged, thinking about cultural knowledges and how Tree of Life can be an approach that helps people to connect with their histories, with their culture, the things that are protective to them, the things that make them feel strong. And so drawing on, even ideas around Ncazelo to think when we do this work, the kind of context that we want to create, in terms of what we want people to experience when we offer them these interventions. And so it is really something that encompasses all these histories and all these ideas. And so the methodology, as I say, was introduced to me by someone who'd taken it from, a handbook by Sally Enhope and Sally Timmel. That's where the first Tree of Life tool came from. And then taking it up with David Denbrough and rethinking about how we could make it a narrative approach, one that is really, embracing of people's cultures and helping people to tell even their cultural stories in ways that are helpful. So it's a 4-part process which involves drawing trees. And then there is a second part of the methodology, which is about the forest of life. So Tree of Life begins with inviting people to draw their tree. And each part of the tree represents something specific about their lives, their roots, where they come from, their history, their heritage, their ancestry, the ground where they live, who they live with, what they like to do when they're at home, favorite places, favorite songs or dances, the trunk, their skills and their knowledges, the things they're good at, the things that people tell them they're good at, the leaves of their tree, most important people in their lives, people who care for them, support them, and then the branches, your hopes, your dreams, for both the near and the distant future. And then the fruits are the gifts that you've received and that you've been given. And so people are invited to come up with their tree, and then they are supported to tell stories around these aspects of their lives by somebody who has been trained, who knows how to help them to thicken these stories, because we want people to stand firmly in the second stories of their lives, in the alternative stories, the stories about your hopes, your dreams, your skills, the people that are important to you, your aspirations, in your life. So we need people to experience themselves stepping more and more firmly into these alternative stories. And so once people have had a chance to be interviewed in groups, because this is a group approach, working with 5 to 6 people in a group, and everyone in the group has an opportunity to be interviewed on their trees of life. And so the second part of the methodology is then called the forest of life. And so we invite people then to put their trees together in this, to form a beautiful forest of trees. And here the thinking is that we want people to experience a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness, to be thinking about who stands in their forest of life with them, and what these people bring and contribute to their lives, but also how they contribute to other people's lives. The forest of life is a very rich metaphor that can help to strengthen a sense of connectedness, a sense of collaboration, and giving people a really rich sense of belonging. And so we can also inquire about how to keep this forest strong, and some of the things that we do in our day-to-day lives to nurture our forests of life, and how, the different trees in the forest with the different skills can come together and work together to achieve the things that are important. We talk about the values, and the things that can be sustaining of this forest and so on. So a very, very rich metaphor to kind of support connectedness and collaboration. And then from the forest of life, we then move on to the third part of the methodology, which is the storms of life. And this is where we invite people to now talk to some of the hardships and the hazards that beautiful trees in a forest can experience. So this one is a virtual forest, because Tree of Life can be done, virtually. And this is a forest from a group of psychiatric nurses working in Uganda. And so just wanting to show that we can do this work even online. And so the storms of life metaphor is applied to support people to name and explore the effects that problems have on their lives. And we want to talk about these storms that sometimes visit us in our lives, how they affect us, what they take away from us, what they separate from us, what they diminish in our lives, how sometimes storms can recruit us into practices and ways of being that go against our own better judgment and our own values. So a very useful metaphor for talking about problems and hardships. What is beautiful about this metaphor is that storms are not always present, and that as much as we can be talking to the storms, we can also be talking to the times when there are no storms and how we want to be living our lives. But we also know that during storms, there are things that we can do to hide from the storm, to protect ourselves from the storm. Thinking about how animals, hide away, hibernate during storms and protect their young ones. We too are not passive recipients of storms. There are things that we do to protect ourselves, to hide away from the storm, to keep our hope that there will be a better day, and so on. And so all these conversations become extremely important. And then finally, the methodology ends with the certificate and the song, which is really about celebration. People have been on a journey, exploring the second stories, the alternative stories, stories about their culture, the people that they love, their leaves, their branches, their hopes and their dreams. And it can really be a journey that really shifts people's sense of who they are, what they want for themselves, and so on. And so we end with a celebration and a public acknowledgement of the gains that people have made through this intervention. And so we bring in song and dance, sharing food, and many of our cultural ways of being are featured through this public acknowledgement. So this is what Tree of Life is about. I hope this presentation has given you a sense of a little bit about the histories of this approach, and some of the underpinnings or the ideas that inform it. This is the first group in the world, young people in South Africa and Soweto, who experienced the first Tree of Life sort of pilot that was ever done, and it was working with these young people having moved into South Africa that very year, that I got so much hope, thinking about the day of doom and how children were very sad and they were crying and wailing, and then using this methodology and seeing the hope, the enthusiasm for life, even when these children were going through many, many difficult times. And so this is around 2006. And so this being something that was very hopeful, I wrote about this, and it was published in the Journal of Narrative Therapy and Community Work. And this is what has helped to take Tree of Life all over the world. Today, Tree of Life is used in over 40 countries around the world by different people in mental health services and in psychosocial services. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work to you. I hope that you found it helpful. I don't know if we still have time, perhaps, for a couple of questions and for people to talk to me. I do run training on this methodology, and if people would like to learn how to work with it, I think through Rugare, you are able to get details about the intervention and the training that I offer. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I was just about to let you know that you're about 32 minutes into your lecture, and you just finished. Thanks so much for that. Yes, there are questions in the chat. While I go to the chat, let me ask those with questions to please ask directly. I'm going to ask Professor Janestic in about 5 minutes to thank Ncazelo for the lecture, because Ncazelo will be leaving at the end of this lecture. So please prepare for that. Questions, I'll take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. Meanwhile, I'm checking the questions in the chat. So people are talking about the metaphor, the Mbeleko metaphor, and somebody just told us what they call it in their country. It's called Ingozi in Uganda. It's also called, it's got another name that I saw from from
Ethiopia.
From Ethiopia. What was it? Who saw that?
Wasi, what was it?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm looking for a question. There's a question that I saw, but I can't see it in chat, but there's a question that was in the chat that I even gave a thumbs up. Questions? Questions, please. Yeah, so here is the question. So the Tree of Life and the blanket metaphor are being an indigenized understanding and utilization of narrative practices. I will read that again. So are the Tree of Life and blanket metaphor being an indigenized understanding and utilization of narrative practices. That's a question for you, Ncazelo.
Thank you very much. Perhaps yes, but essentially it speaks about what therapy means to us. For many years, for many times, told that African people don't take to therapy. They don't see it as being important. But I think for me, it speaks sometimes to how, when it is presented in particular ways, people just don't get it. They don't understand it. And so when we are able to use our own indigenous ways of explaining and framing what we're trying to do with people and how we want to be connecting with people, it just makes sense. And it allows them to bring themselves more fully into these experiences in ways that are culturally validating. And so Mbeleko for me is really about an expression of what I believe therapy is about, and using a local metaphor, local concepts to be able to kind of inspire how we do it. Whether you're using narrative or whatever modalities you might use it, but we should not lose, some of our own wisdoms and knowledges so that people can understand what this is about, I hope at least.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for answering that question. Another question, is there a book?
I've recently contributed to a chapter in a book that's talking to psychology and mental health, and I was invited to write about Mbeleko. So I do hope it's going to be published sometime in the future. Rugari, I'll keep you, on the loop so that if it's available, then you can talk to the community and share it with them. Dulwich is involved, David Denbrough is involved in the publication. And so, hopefully in the future, I'll be able to actually write a full book myself, but that's what I've done so far. Yeah. That's
all right. Thank you so much. And there's also the journal article that you did, I think with David. It would be important for us as well to share that one. I've got access to that and I'll be able to share with others.
Yeah.
This is a comment from Malati. Very beautiful listening to you. Thank you, Diuse. That's from my heart, from Malati's language.
Thank you.
Then another one, I really like these models and methods. Then would it be possible to share your slides or reading recommendations, please? That's from Sarah Hitchin.
All right, I can share notes. I've got notes that I give. If we could follow that, Rugari, around, what I've just presented. That's normally what I give to participants. Yeah.
That's all right. Thank you so much. I think there are two more questions. This one, I think, starts as a compliment. I totally agree that we should use friendly, culturally relevant presentation of our practice and services being provided. However, in this case, it seems to have a conflict between internal validity and generalization. Expecting a further explanation. Would you be able to say anything about this?
Internal validity and, sorry?
Internal validity and generalization.
I hear you. And so I invite people who would do research, who want to find, evidence and do what they can do to contribute. But for instance, the Tree of Life has been extremely researched. I don't know how many people have done doctorates on it, PhDs, and many, many projects. There's actually a resource list that talks to how these methodologies are being preferred, particularly working with, indigenous communities, ethnic minority populations. And so there's really a growing, interest and desire to use what is culturally relevant and appropriate, particularly with certain populations. So there is research going on out there. And based on practice and what we see in our communities, There's lots of evidence. We collect data routinely, when we do this work. And so if people want to do some research, they're welcome. But certainly there's growing evidence that these ideas work and they do change people's lives in a positive way.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you. So just two short compliments, and I will end with one question. The dominant narrative is that mental health among Africans is a taboo, but you challenge this with such culturally appropriate models. That's from Charlotte. Then from Jill, thank you. A wonderful, inspiring approach. So much for me to learn. That's from Jill. Then from Catherine, thank you for a wonderful presentation and for sharing your own story. Yes, thank you too from me for sharing your own story. So there are so many questions coming, so I'll just pick the last one. The Mbeleko metaphor is quite interesting. It never crossed my mind in that manner. Thanks for acknowledging this, Disari. The tree of life is the most interesting one for me. And I'll tell you, there's also the briefcase one. I will share the Polar Organization's website for people to read more about it. Is it possible we could be trained on how to use this approach as we work in communities that to really gain from this? I also think this approach could help us could help counselors to overcome some of our own traumas. So this will be the last question. And thanks everyone for your questions. You can still keep your questions in, and I'll share those with Ncazelo. Over to you for the last question.
There's Nancy. Nancy has had her hand up for a while.
Oh, yes, I was just looking at the chat questions. Okay, so are you able to respond to the one on training before we ask Nancy?
Yes, the training is very possible. I could share, you could have your own bespoke training as a group if you'd want it that way. Or I could give you a calendar that we publish every year to talk about our online training. So I've developed Tree of Life. I've developed an intervention called Courage, working with women who've experienced trauma, Narratives in the Suitcase, which is for refugees, and recently Outraged, for working with men and boys for the prevention of violence and gender-based violence more specifically. So learning from Tree of Life, I've continued to work with to create methodologies. So we offer training on all the above.
Thank you. Nancy, you are the last one to ask. Please go ahead. Nancy Chara, your hand was up. Please go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see your hand on time. If you get on the meeting before Ncazelo goes, please feel free to ask your question. Professor Twikirize, are you in the meeting? Are you able to give a few thank you remarks to our lecturer before she leaves?
Yes. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Ncazelo. This has been extremely inspiring. And I wanted to re-echo what you said, that we should not lose some of our own wisdom and knowledge. I know there's a question about validity, there's a question about generalization, but I think there was also a comment on that, the strongest validity is what the people find meaningful, what actually, the results of these interventions. Sometimes as scholars, we sort of fear to try out to develop models. I think that's what Jacob's short quiz is about. But we want to applaud you, for having the courage to develop models that are very relevant and appropriate for use, in our context. And so we thank you for making the time to come and talk to us. And we really hope that we can remain in touch. Thank you once again, and please keep them coming. Keep those models coming. We are so grateful. Yes.
Thank you. Wow, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Enjoy the rest of the lecture.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Twikirize, and thanks again, Ncazelo, for the lecture. So we won't waste time.